like to turn to the book of Luke, chapter 12. Book of Luke, chapter 12. We'll read verses 13 through verse 21. And one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. And he said unto him, Man, who made me a judge or divider over you? And he said unto them, Take heed, and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? And he said, This will I do, I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God. Most of the text, verses 16 through 20, consists of Jesus speaking what is known as the parable of the rich fool. The parable could accurately be titled many ways. It could be the parable of practical atheism, or it could be the parable of worldly mindedness, or the parable of a misspent life, or a parable of a life lived for self. But the various titles that could be given to this parable are indicative of its corrective and instructive nature. The subject this morning is the fool owned by a farm, which also could be a title of the parable. The fool owned by a farm. So we want to look at this morning. First of all, we'll begin with the setting and the purpose of the parable. By way of background, leading into the parable, at the beginning of the previous chapter, chapter 11, Jesus is with his disciples. He's teaching them upon the subject of prayer. Toward the end of the chapter, chapter 11, he is seen rebuking the Pharisees. He's telling them that though they had washed the outside, the inside of the cup was full of greed and wickedness, and that they had neglected justice, and that they had neglected love of God, and that they were proud and wanting the most important places in the marketplace, and that they were nothing more than whited graves. It was at this point, verse 45 of chapter 11, Then answered one of the lawyers and said unto him, Master, thus saying, thou reproachest us also. So one of the lawyers, this would be one of the scribes, interrupts Christ. Jesus then proceeded in verses 46 through 52 to rebuke the lawyers or the scribes that were present. The response of the scribes and Pharisees is recorded in verses 53 and 54. And as he said these things unto them, the scribes and the Pharisees began to urge him vehemently to and to provoke him to speak of many things, laying wait for him and seeking to catch something out of his mouth that they might accuse him. So while all of this was going on, the crowd had gathered and was getting larger. We see in chapter 12, verse 1, in the meantime, while all this was going on, when there were gathered together an innumerable multitude of people, that they trode upon one another. And then at this point we read, and Jesus began to say unto his disciples, first of all. That is, what he's saying is primarily meant for the disciples, but it is in the hearing of the multitude. And he says, beware ye, again the disciples, of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is, he's going to identify the leaven of the Pharisees, hypocrisy. He then goes on speaking, and in verse 13, one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. So from the multitude comes a voice, no doubt in the tone of a plea, indicating a sense of urgency. Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. Now the man had just heard Christ speak great spiritual and life-changing truths, and with a sense of urgency cries out, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. Completely unrelated to anything that Jesus had said. No relation whatsoever. And because his mind was consumed with something entirely different than from what Jesus was saying, he did not grasp anything that Jesus had said. In light of everything that Jesus said, the only thing that this man was concerned about was an earthly inheritance, and that he was being done wrong by his brother. So he's unconcerned about the condition of his own heart. He is obsessed with his brother's behavior, and the reason he is obsessed with his brother's behavior is because it affected him. And he cries out, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. So this man was obsessed with the thought that his brother was going to cheat him out of an earthly inheritance. So in the presence of Jesus Christ, and having heard life-changing truths, this man is thoroughly distracted and sidetracked by a temporal affair. Happens all the time. He is so focused upon what he thought to be a problem that he was really not interested in what Christ was saying. He was not interested in the message of Christ, and he certainly could not grasp the message of Christ. What he thought to be a problem was more important to him than what Jesus was saying. His mind is consumed with what he thinks is most important. Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. He's telling Jesus, not only speak to my brother, but here's what you are to tell him. He must divide the inheritance with me. No interest in the message of Christ. He simply wants Jesus to do something for him or in his behalf regarding something temporal. That he divide the inheritance with me. The man wanted what he thought was due him. And that's where his mind was stuck. He's not hearing Christ for himself, but he's saying, tell my brother. Tell my brother he needs to do such and such toward me. In response, verse 14, and he said unto him, so now, again, you have the disciples, you have a multitude, and you have this man speaking out from the multitude, and he said unto him, so he's speaking directly to this individual. And what he says to him is, it's not my business to settle such controversies. That's not what I'm here for. He's telling him, I'm here for another purpose. Something far more important than what you're talking about. So then he proceeds in verse 15, and he said unto them. Okay, so it's gone from he said unto him to he said unto them. The them, I believe, again, the disciples first of all. He's speaking primarily to the disciples in the hearing of the multitude. He said unto them. And coming to verse 15, he proceeds to give a warning. He says, take heed. Now this warning has its basis in what the one has already spoken to Christ about, dividing the inheritance. He says, take heed. That is, give earnest attention, which is indicative of the importance of the matter. He says, take heed and beware. That is, be cautious. It's indicative of a present danger. Beware of covetousness. This is the object of the danger. Covetousness. Beware. So one of the purposes of the parable is to give a warning. A warning against covetousness. Now, covetousness is an inward matter of the heart. It involves thoughts, desires, attitudes, and these can engross the heart. So it is a desire without due regard for God or the matters of God. Again, this man had heard Christ speak. He really had no regard for what Christ was saying. He was only interested in that inheritance. He was guilty of covetousness. It is basically selfish ambition. Covetousness. It is described in Proverbs 15:27 by the words, he that is greedy of gain. The word greedy means to thirst, to hunger, to crave, to long for more. He that is greedy of gain. The covetous are those who labor to be rich. In Proverbs 23 verse 4, the instruction is, labor not to be rich. That's not the purpose of labor. The purpose of labor is not to be rich. The purpose of labor is to provide necessities. Labor not to be rich. That's a warning against covetousness. They are those who have set their eyes upon a desire, and this desire consumes them. Notice in Proverbs 23. Proverbs 23. And verse 5. When thou set thine eyes upon that which is not, for riches certainly make themselves wings, they fly away as an eagle toward heaven. Set thine eyes upon that which is not. That's covetousness. They've set their eyes, they've set their focus upon these things, and the desire becomes the center, and everything revolves around it. So the covetous coincide with Proverbs 28:22, he that hasteth to be rich. Labor not to be rich, he that hasteth to be rich. And also with 1 Timothy 6 verse 9, that they that will be rich, speaking of a desire to be rich, a determination to be rich. And it is further described in 1 Timothy 6 verse 10 by the love of money. And then he goes on to say the love of money is the root of all evil. It's not money is the root of all evil, it is the love of money. That's covetousness. The love of money is the root of all evil, which some have coveted after. They have erred from the faith because their desire for riches, or whatever it is, becomes all important. Faith becomes secondary. They err from the faith, and they've pierced themselves through, this is the result, with many sorrows. So we hear the Lord say in our text, beware of covetousness. Beware. He is, again, this is in light of, speak to my brother, tell him to divide the inheritance with me. And then the reason to beware of covetousness. For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. And this becomes another purpose of the parable. So one purpose of the parable is to warn against covetousness. The other purpose is to illustrate this truth, that a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesses. So a purpose of the parable is to illustrate that life is not measured, nor is the source of life in the sphere of the temporal. That's illustrated in the parable. One of the purposes of the parable is that we beware of how we measure life. Life consisteth not in the things which a man possesseth. And what we view as life's source. Following the parable, Jesus makes application, verse 21, so is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God. And then in verse 22, and he said unto his disciples, again, he's speaking directly to them. He turns and he speaks directly to the disciples, and he reiterates some things that he said in the Sermon on the Mount. So one of the purposes of the parable is to enforce these truths. Not to become so engrossed and consumed with the matters of life. So that brings us to the parable. The man who spoke from the multitude He's concerned about one thing: what he can receive. And he coincides with the man in the parable that is called a fool. Now, the man in the parable would have been considered by the world to be a successful man. He would have been looked at as a man of wisdom, a man intelligent, a man who is well organized. He's a very capable individual. He's a man of great foresight. He is someone to be envied. But here Jesus say of this man, verse 20, "Thou fool, thou fool." A fool is one who lacks judgment or understanding, one who is without discernment, one who is of a reckless habit of mind, one who squanders or trifles with that which is truly valuable. The man in the parable was a rich man. We read in verse 16, a certain rich man. That's not what made him a fool. Jesus did not call him a fool because he was rich. In fact, he never condemned his riches, not once. He never condemned his prosperity. His riches is not what made him a fool. The man is a fool concerning his perception of value, concerning his perception of what is important. The man saw the most value and the most importance in fruits, barns, and goods. He is a fool concerning priorities. He gave priority to fruits, barns, and goods. This man is a fool concerning the object of life. He thought the object of life was found in fruits, barns, and goods. This man is a fool because of his goal in life. Verse 19. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. His primary goal was to be merry, to be happy. That's his goal in life. May I say that is almost everybody's goal in life, to be happy. And he's thinking that where this happiness is found is ease, eat, and drink. That's where happiness is found. And the thought that what made this happiness attainable was, again, fruits, barns, and goods. The more fruit I have, the more barns I have, the more goods I have, then in the future I'll be able to take my ease, I'll have plenty to eat, I'll have plenty to drink, and I'll be happy. His whole thought process is foolish. And therefore Jesus said, "Thou fool." So this is where he saw value. This is where he saw importance. Consequently, this is where he put his effort. This is where he put his energy. This is what he gave his thoughts to. You are going to put forth the most effort, the most energy, and you're going to think about the most what is important to you. This man is a fool because he did not understand how his possessions related to his life. He looked upon them as his own. He says, my fruits, my barns, my goods. He looked at everything as his own, with absolutely no thought of the one who gave it to him, no thought of glorifying God with his abundance. This man is a fool because he looked to temporal things for satisfaction and for security. And as he looked upon his fruits, his barns, his goods, he feels very secure. And he feels invincible. He's a fool because he did not realize that the best things in life are not things. He's a fool. This man was a fool because he thought in terms of I. In the conversation with himself, verses 17 through 19, he uses the pronouns I and my 11 times. His focus is all wrong. He is the center. The ruling spirit of his life is self. This man was a fool because he thought himself to be self-sufficient. As a result, there's no record of him consulting God. In all of his receiving, in all of his calculations, in all of his resolving and his anticipating, there appears to be a neglect of God. He leaves God out of the equation. He leaves death out of the equation. Perhaps he believed in God, but he lived as if there was no God. Psalm 14:1, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. That's practical atheism. You can say you believe in God. You can say you believe there is a God, but live as if there were not. Many of God's people are guilty of practical atheism. This man was a fool because he lived life this way, as if there were no God. Therefore, all his preparations were wrong. And in verse 18, he's preparing to tear down and to build greater. And his intentions were wrong. And there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. His motives are wrong. Verse 19, his motive is that one day he'll be able to take his ease, eat, drink, and be merry. That's the American dream. It's based in covetousness. This man is a fool because he did not realize that all is vanity without God. He didn't learn the lesson that Solomon learned by the time he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. This man was a fool because he was short-sighted. And all who leave God out of the equation are short-sighted. All he could see was the temporal. The truth is, this man was owned by his farm. It took over his life. When the temporal takes over your life, that's foolish. It controlled his life. Beware of the tyranny of things, of the temporal. Many a child of God live under the tyranny of the temporal, under the tyranny of problems and afflictions and difficulties and circumstances. Personal examination is necessary. What is it that controls us. We're all controlled by something. What is it that controls us? What is it that we live for? Not what we say we live for, but what is it that we live for? What is it that determines the direction of our lives? What do we build our lives around? This man was a fool because he neglected the end, and he did not consider accountability to God. Because of his foolishness, he made bad choices. He made bad choices. His choices centered around I and fruits, barns, and goods. Because his choices were centered around the wrong things, his choices were bad choices. He put self above God. Jesus, in summarizing the parable, verse 21 said, "So is he that layeth up treasure for himself." His thinking was ensnared in self. His thinking was ensnared in these things because he believes these things will cause him to reach the ultimate goal of happiness. So is he that layeth up treasure for himself. To lay up is a choice. To lay up is a deliberation. It is a willful act. This man in the parable, because he put more value, because he put more importance upon the temporal, and because he looked to such for satisfaction, for security and happiness, he gave priority to these things. If you believe that object A is going to bring you happiness, that's what you're going to give the most thought to. And this man believed this. And the Lord called him a fool. He gave priority to these things. And again, if you believe that these things are going to cause you to reach your ultimate goal, you're going to give priority to that. So he deliberately chose fruits, barns, and goods over eternal things. And they were catastrophic choices. People's choices are determined by where their heart is. Because of where his heart was, this man put self above God. And the result? Catastrophic choices. Catastrophic. People make choices all the time. Sometimes you have to choose. Many times. You have to choose spiritual, temporal. And any time the temporal is put over or given priority to the spiritual, that's a bad choice. That's a bad choice. Because this man's heart was not right, his priorities were not right. His thinking was warped. And he made bad choices. Because of all this, he was not rich toward God. He was not rich spiritually. Temporally, he was rich. From the world's point of view, he was rich. But Jesus closes the parable in verse 21 by saying, concerning this man and all who are like him, that he's not rich toward in the direction of God. So here's a man. He could go out upon his property. He could look to the north. He could look to the south. He could look to the east, and he could look to the west. And he could see his fields, his crops, his fruits, his barns, and his goods. He could go within his barns and see them bursting forth, and plainly see that he had enough in store for years to come. But when he looked in the direction of heaven, he was poor. He was poor. This man put forth more energy, more effort, more thought toward fruit, barns, and goods than his own soul. And the result was he was not rich toward God. This man, with all of his plans, all of his preparations, all of his intentions, had lost sight of the shortness and unpredictability of time. He lost sight of that. He was owned by a farm. It's what controlled his life. And the Lord said, "Thou fool." He coincides with the man who spoke from the multitude, "Tell my brother to give me my part of the inheritance." Jesus is calling this man a fool. He's saying, I'm speaking wonderful truths to you, and all you see is the temporal. Thou fool. Thou fool. Oh, how careful we need to be by what owns us. What we become a slave to. Be careful. It's very easy to cross that line where we are owned by that which really doesn't matter. In the big scheme of things, it really doesn't matter. And it's what owns us. It's what controls our lives. And Jesus says, "Thou fool." Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song, we'll